We'll move on to the next session on pitch training. This will be conducted by Jonathan J.C. Charles, as well as Kousha Navidar. Jonathan is an investment director in the Samsung Catalyst Fund. He has been a team member for the past 7 years. He is currently an investment director investing across a variety of sectors, including Industry 4.0, semiconductors and sensors, IoT, cloud infrastructure, and consumer electronic devices. He is a member of the Society of Kaufman Venture Capital Fellows and recently was selected as a top 3 global corporate venture capitalist in 2020 by the Global Corporate Venturing Organization. Joining him is going to be Kousha Navidar. He is the head of content for Samsung Strategy and Innovation Center. Kousha has developed messaging strategy for CEOs, celebrities, political leaders, and plenty of startups from around the world. His experience started in television and speech writing. At PBS, he helped produce and host a national television show. Before that, he was a speechwriter and political appointee in the former US President Barack Obama's administration. So with that, please welcome JC and Kousha, and we take it away, gentlemen.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today for the Extreme Tech Challenge. We're so honored to be working with you, those startups that are trying to address the world's most pressing global challenges. This is really exciting for us. So in this session, or part of this session, we will be talking about the basic pitch framework. But there's a couple of things I wanted to do to kind of get us started, just to sort of level set. We realize that your companies may be at different stages in the life cycle of when you started versus where you are today. Please keep in mind that this is sort of calibrated for more early stage startups. So some of you may have some more experience with this than others. And a lot of this kind of information you might be able to find online. So what we've done is we've very carefully thought through some nuances. We hope we've uncovered some fresh new material for you. And then I'd also like to add some personal sort of anecdotes and situations that I've actually experienced myself, which I think can help inform teams how to become better at pitching. So, as you can see on the left-hand side, the basic framework is typically, you introduce the team and the product and you go on through the different elements. 2, 3, and 4, you can probably switch around a little bit depending on the flow and the story you want to tell. And then you have the standard things like the business model. But as you can see in the last 2, in 6 and 7 in pink, I wanted to talk about inflection points and value creation. And I'm so excited that Eric from BGV in the prior session actually used the phrase inflection points. And that's something that is kind of beyond just talking about traction. And we'll get into a little detail around that. And then, of course, here today, we're thinking about the Extreme Tech Challenge and pitching in the 4-minute format and then the 3-minute format. So I had a little bit of a commentary on the relevance of what I'm trying to say today vis-a-vis XTC in and of itself versus a traditional pitch. As we go through the different sections, on the right-hand side, you'll see a section called Level Up. So this is based on my personal experiences in seeing many, many pitches over the years. And I want to talk about a couple of situations that I experienced just recently, which will put a little bit of color on how do other teams do it, either really good or really bad. Keep in mind that this basic framework can be expanded depending on what your pitch time actually is. There's the 10-minute pitch, the 20-minute pitch, so on and so forth. There's even one shorter called the elevator pitch, which can be as short as 2 minutes. That one has a very high difficulty level. But sometimes pitches can also go, of course, 60 minutes or even more. I've been at 90-minute pitches, which get really interesting as well. And key thing here is to always be flexible and always be prepared. And what I mean by that is sometimes you come across VCs, for example, and this is a very specific example, and they may say, yeah, very interesting, maybe not a fit for us. Do you have a short executive summary or a 3-page deck that I could send over to somebody that I know really well that I think you might be a fit for? And the worst thing you can do there is not be prepared and then take a week to create that material, and you've already lost some momentum. So intro, team and product. So on the left-hand side, pretty straightforward. You typically do a quick description of the product. Maybe you actually show it and, show the prototype or whatever you have. And then, you want to talk about the high-level value proposition for your customer, because you're going to get into that later, typically in the deck in just a few slides. And then you can start talking about why is your team best outfitted to work on this for the customer. And this starts getting into what Kousha was talking about in a session earlier today, which is about character and sort of personalizing and making more human your story. On the right hand side, leveling up, and you've already heard about this, I might call this the hook. And in an earlier session, you heard about all these things, character and humanization, which Kousha had already talked about. But basically, let me just kind of paraphrase it. Maybe it's how your team came together to address this challenge. Maybe you worked at a big company together and you already worked in this sector and you were thinking about this and you wanted to do something, faster, harder, stronger. So you went out and did a startup. Or maybe you have a personal connection. One time I went to a biotech pitch years ago, and it turned out two of the founders were brothers, and their mother had a very serious illness, and she almost died. And they were so taken aback by this and so emotionally drained, they actually realized, the true pain of it. So they decided to go out and start a biotech company to address this specific challenge. Let me talk to you about a pitfall that I saw just a couple of weeks ago, something that you don't want to do. I was on one of the longer pitches. It was about an hour, but unfortunately, the team of founders brought quite a few people from their team, and they spent 20 minutes out of an hour going through the entire team's biographies. And they were droning on. It was actually quite painful. You could see on the Zoom call that quite a few people were uncomfortable. What I would say is, the key thing is the CEO. What is the background? What is their relevance? How can they address the challenge? All those kind of things. If you've got a very technical product with a lot of IP and innovation, you may also want to consider adding the biography of the CTO as well. Sometimes you have to check everybody's egos. Everybody wants to be seen and heard. There's always a time for other team members to be sort of introduced to the investors once you get further into due diligence. So, I would focus just on one or perhaps two of the key executives. So customer challenge or challenges, the basics are, who is your ideal customer? What challenges do they face? I'm sure you've all given this a lot of thought and you've already got some slideware around this. And how does your product address this? You want to keep it sort of short here because you're going to go more into your solution on the following slide. But what I wanted to sort of bring up in the level up is a couple of things. And one of them is, I think, very key and something that you may have heard about, but I think that you should really kind of level up on. It starts with a data-driven sort of analysis of the customer challenge. Do you understand this challenge because you have specific industry experience? You worked in that sector? Or do you understand this challenge because you talk to a lot of potential customers and you actually have data that proves some hypothesis you were testing? Or better yet, it's a combination of the two. And where this kind of leads you is on the path of what I call a customer-centric culture. If you think about some of the great companies out there, I'll pick one that was very customer-centric from the early days of the internet. It's Amazon, a giant 800-pound gorilla in the industry, very successful company that's known around the world. If you kind of study the history of that company, Jeff Bezos, a fantastic entrepreneur, had a maniacal focus on customer. Everybody sort of knows about the one-click patent and the recommendations on the website that other companies weren't doing at the time. But what they may not know is if you peel back that onion, that was a very data-driven focus on customer. So I have quite a few friends from school that actually went to work at Amazon. And what I learned was every single day, everything they do, it's all about the customer, understanding what they want, and what is the data that proves that, and then how can the company, in this case Amazon, execute on that data to circle back and service the customer. This is a very strong culture that you can build very early on in your company, and it is the best way, I think, to approach managing your business and creating value. Let me give you one quick example about this, which I found very interesting, which I also heard just a couple of weeks ago. I was working with a company in the Industry 4.0 space, and they had a manufacturing software product. And what they thought was originally, let's create this SaaS product, and the customers will buy it on a monthly basis. And at the end of the day, we flip a switch and they get their beautiful dashboards and a whole bunch of data collected from the manufacturing line. But then I heard something very interesting. They actually said, the customers were requesting a custom sort of consulting service. So here they are with a software product, and their customer kept telling us basically, please help us. We don't actually understand all the data, or there may be something unique about our data. Can you kind of handhold us and maybe send over some of your team and kind of work with us on better understanding what are we actually looking at in those dashboards? So the CEO of the company said, aha, the customers want this and they're going to pay for it, and this creates value. So you know what? We're actually, this is not a pivot because they're still, the main product is still a SaaS product, but what they did is they actually added to the product line to bring joy to their customer and create value. So now they actually have, in a sense, two product lines that they can actually monetize. So fantastic example of actually having one thesis or one direction, but then listening very carefully to those customers and then servicing that customer and creating value around it. That's where you want to be, always listening to those customers and bringing joy to them, upon which they will pay. So the next slide after you discuss that challenge is, okay, what's your product? What's your solution? How do you address it? I'm sure you all have slides on this, but a couple of things to level up on this sort of topic. The key point in talking about your solution is building credibility. And this overlaps a little bit with sort of the assessment of the market and competition. But one thing that I wanted to bring up, which believe it or not, I hear actually probably way too often, frankly too much, is every now and then I'll hear, we don't have any competitors. This does not impress investors, to be perfectly honest, is everybody has a competitor. At the bare minimum, your competition may be customers decide to do nothing. They may decide to just use what they have currently or literally do nothing. It doesn't happen all the time in terms of doing nothing, but it's possible. So if you start the conversation with your investors that, hey, we have this great product and look, we have no competitors, instantly you've actually created yourself a disservice and you're losing credibility with those customers. In particular, if we peel back the onion on this point, competition can often be the 800-pound gorilla out there, right? The Microsofts and Googles of the world, the Facebooks of the world. These kind of big publicly traded companies, of course, have a lot of resources. They may be somewhat related to your market. They may be already in your market, or they could choose to just enter your market out of the blue. And I think it's important to address this early on if it's relevant, because you want to begin that conversation with the investors to build that credibility. And then it turns out, if you peel back even more, investors spend a lot of time actually thinking about these markets. They know about competitors, both small startups and the 800-pound gorillas. And you want your investor ultimately to be your partner on your journey of value creation to ultimately get to the goal you want to do, whether it's going public or being acquired. But the key point there is you want to have that dialogue back and forth. And guess what? Sometimes the investors may have actually worked at some of these companies or had been, vendors to those companies, and they know them very well. And now as investors, they're thinking about them all the time. And they may know actually more than you do, and you want to get that dialogue going, an exchange of information where, it's okay to be in a market where there may be a big, giant 800-pound gorilla, but you want to think about it strategically. Maybe you actually have something you have in your product or in your strategy that actually allows you to compete effectively. Numerous companies have taken on amazing big challenges, taken on those 800-pound gorillas and created value. So market sizing. So of course, who are your customers? How many are out there? How much do they spend? Those are all the basics. One thing that I wanted to actually point out, particularly in the world of COVID, is are you experiencing any tailwinds, meaning things that accelerate the buying of your product because of things like COVID? Or maybe it's regulation, or maybe it's some other macroeconomic event. Tailwinds can come from many different things, but that's actually something to think about, particularly right now in the world of COVID. If you think about leveling up when it comes to market size, numerous times I've seen people just, throw out market research from Gartner, Forrester, McKinsey, all these third-party sort of research and consulting firms. And the brutal reality is a lot of investors don't really believe a lot of these numbers anyways. And I've done this many times myself. If you sort of compare and contrast across these different forms of market research, they very rarely have their own, they very rarely align on a single number or even close. Sometimes they can be dramatically off, which actually doesn't build a lot of credibility because the numbers are all different. So it's fine to bring up these kind of numbers, but it's very important to build your own numbers as well. And I'm sure you've all kind of studied the top-down and bottom-up approaches. It's best to actually have both those approaches. But what I would say is once you start coalescing around a number, say a combination of third-party research, but primarily also your own sort of analysis and spreadsheets, it's really good to make all of that really simple for the investors to understand. You can call it market math, but you can actually lay it out in a nice graphical format. That's much appreciated. Something that's very quickly and easily digestible. Really good to footnote all of your numbers so people actually know where they came from, whether they were from third parties or whether they're your numbers themselves. And let me tell you about something that, believe it or not, I actually do hear a couple of times a year, which is not a way to level up. I've come across startups that have said, if we just get 1% of this, whichever gigantic market, it could either be a sector or literally, say, a geography, we'll do awesome. That's not really sophisticated. And again, it doesn't really build credibility. A specific example is somebody might say, hey, if we just get 1% of US healthcare, we'll be great. We'll be awesome. We'll create value. Well, US healthcare is a multi-trillion-dollar industry. It's government regulated. It's highly fragmented. It's fiercely competitive. So, how are you going to get even 1%? There's actually many different parts of healthcare, everything from actually delivering services to patients, to imaging, to claims processing. It's very, very complicated. So it's sort of amateurish to say, we're going to get 1% and we'll be fine. You've got to have a much more depth than that. Business models. So, effectively, how do you make money? How do you think about your pricing? What's your go-to-market strategy? And what are the key channel, technical, and other partners you need to get to where you're going when it comes to this business model? A little more depth here on the level up. So pricing, it's very important to have a pricing methodology. And what I mean by that is, it's not good in building that credibility with the investors if you are kind of guessing on your pricing. I was literally on a call not even 10 days ago where the CEO was actually talking about, well, we kind of picked this number. And it really sounded like he just pulled that number out of a hat. That did not build credibility with me and my team member on the call. And immediately we started thinking, wow, they have a lot of work to do and maybe they should come back to us in the future. You have to get out there, talk to customers. There's research in this area. I wouldn't solely rely on research. Depending on the industry, there's research or not. But you basically have to do a lot of the legwork around pricing. Super important topic. I have seen data that actually indicates that particularly early stage startups tend to underprice their products as well, and they leave money on the table. So you don't want to go that way either. Another really interesting thing popped up the other day. I was actually on a pitch call similar to this one with the University of Chicago with some very early stage startups. And the people that were assessing these startups came across a very technical founder who had a PhD in a very technical discipline related to semiconductors. Nobody disputed that this person was the proper, say, CTO of the company. But what got exposed very quickly was this person was completely out of their depth in the capability of working with technical and go-to-market partners in the very complicated and fiercely competitive semiconductor industry. It was almost as if this person had a blind spot to elements of the business model, which was not a good thing. Now, of course, this is an early stage university-based startup, and certainly that person needs to add team members over time. But in and of itself, on that day, at that pitch, I'll say that the committee that was assessing this company actually decided to pass for nothing to do with the technology or product, but everything to do with the founder of the company that was completely out of their depth on those technical and go-to-market partners. So please don't leave those out in assessing how am I going to build value creation and get to market and bring joy to my customers and then monetize that. Those partners are super important. Related to that, of course, you may need to bring in the right business development people that hopefully have experience in those sectors or the sector that you're focused on. Let me make a comment also on complex business models. So if you think of certain sectors, they're pretty straightforward. There's a customer, you have a product, and they buy it. But not all sectors are created equal. Some are actually very complicated, where there's multiple intermediaries. For example, perhaps ad tech comes to mind. And this person pays that person, and that person does something to the product, and then they flip it over and they sell it to something else. And your product is, sometimes investors, unless they specifically come from that sector, it can actually be quite confusing for them. So if you've got a sort of a complex business model, number one, you should be focusing on investors that have experience on that. That probably goes without saying. But if you're actually coming across VCs that might consider that market, make it simple for them. And diagrams are great. I think this is a great tool that you can use. And sometimes it's actually underused by different startups. So you may want to have that, but keep in mind, you could also have that detailed diagram either in the appendix or in one of the longer decks for, the follow-on pitches. Inflection points of value creation. Also known as traction, but there's a lot of depth here, which is why I don't like to use the word traction. Typically, traction is just, what is my sales trajectory, things like that. If you're a SaaS company, it could be, your monthly recurring revenue that you may have read about. And then if you're sort of a product company that has a physical thing, typically it would be the number of units sold. But I think value creation is much more complicated than that. If you're thinking about what have you accomplished from the last financing, the inflection point is what different elements of value creation have you added to your company from that last goal point. So say you move from a seed round to an A round or an A round to a B round, so on and so forth. There are multiple inflection points of value creation. They could be things like, development of your product, the development of your team. Let's say, for example, how have you expanded your sales team? You have inside salespeople, outside salespeople, the head of sales, tracking those kind of things. Your financing progress in and of itself can be inflection points of value creation. Marketing activities, there's numerous categories that are very important when it comes to creating value for your company. And similar to what I said about having a customer-centric focus and a culture around that, I believe you can actually build a culture around inflection points and measuring the value creation. Like you can be, just as you can be maniacal and very laser focused on your customer, you should also be laser focused internally on these points. And guess what? These, of course, just like being focused on your customer, are data driven, and it's a fantastic way to drive a better understanding of what are those inflection points. When you have these inflection points, number one, it very much eases communication with investors. Remember, just like Eric from BGV said, pattern recognition, you hear all this time. And what that means is VCs are connecting the dots between every time they talk to you or get a communication from you, even if it's as simple as an email, and they're kind of tracking the progress. What this is they're seeing the difference, the time, the amplitude of these inflection points. And they're looking for the value that is created by them. So you're communicating with them around inflection points, but then you can also use it to communicate actually internally. Imagine when you're talking about hiring with your HR manager. That's something that absolutely has to be data driven. And there are inflection points when you bring on different team members over time. And, I think this is something that in some startups is definitely sort of underestimated. I think all startups eventually get it, but if you create this culture from day one, this actually starts creating value immediately, and it makes your life, it's not easy to do. You have to develop a discipline around it, but it makes your life ultimately more easier to explain to everybody the value creation that you have executed on. So I would suggest that you live, eat, and breathe inflection points and the data that it's built on, that drives that. So the ask. So typically in a pitch, of course, at the end you have an ask about financing, right? I would like to raise X amount of dollars. This is where it's going to take us. Key point: you should always have details around your break-even point and how much more money you need to actually add as you go along. This I actually often see is actually left out, which is kind of a curious thing, because VCs are always thinking through, where are my dollars going to go today? What else do you need to add on top to create value? And then how do we get on the path of value creation ultimately for an exit or an IPO? And around this, let's dig into some of the details so you can level up. This may be surprising to you, but what I'm going to say, I often see actually quite the opposite of it, which is not ideal. That's leveling down, but you want to level up, of course. So first is know your financial model. And I mean, not just the finance person on your team, particularly all the executives should know the financial model cold. When I work on financial models myself, I like to say I ultimately get into the zone where, without even physically changing a number in a cell on a spreadsheet, I already sort of intuitively know what the ultimate change to the model will be. That's where I believe teams should be, particularly the CEO, the CFO, if you're more advanced and you actually have one, if you're a more later stage company, of course, but even perhaps some of the other founders as well. And key point, which I see this all the time, and this brings a lot of angst across investors, which is please make your models usable. I often come across CFOs and with earlier stage companies, teams that actually have multiple models, the cash flow statements over here, the balance sheets over there, and I get a cut and paste, no formula version of the model in my mailbox. That's not usable. And then I have to go back to them. I have to plead for, this document, that document. Something like this can blow up a deal for you. So you don't want to do that. Integrated models from day one that you can just send over to potential investors is absolutely the way to do it. And, another finer point I'd want to make is investors are not always looking for the right number. They may not actually know. What they're looking for and what they're testing is your understanding of your business and the logic that you use to build those numbers. A lot of VCs will actually build their own models, and they will compare and contrast. We typically do that. They will compare and contrast to your model to sort of, level set and test. And anybody that claims that they can predict the future with 100% certainty is probably making it up, right? Nobody can predict the future. But what VCs do is, as we've heard earlier today, is they do pattern recognition, and they have a sense of the industry and the sectors, and they kind of know what would be reasonable, and then what would be underperforming, and then what would be a really good, awesome outcome. That's the whole point of the model, is to explore these different scenarios under different circumstances. And then finally, let me leave you with another story about how I came across another CEO just a couple of weeks ago who was very disciplined on the types of investors that he wanted to focus on. Very, very disciplined. It was super impressive. So the amateur approach to this is you just carpet bomb everybody on LinkedIn and you say, hey, I'll just randomly pick one. I'm a mobile gaming startup. What do you think of my startup? And it turns out on, say, my LinkedIn profile and our website, at no time does it actually say that we look at mobile gaming apps. So this entrepreneur has not only wasted my time, which, that's fine. This is my job. But more importantly, they've wasted their time, and their time is far more precious than my time. So they've actually done themselves a disservice. Contrast that with an investor that I was just working with who, in a very disciplined way, said, I only want to work with corporate venture capitalists in this round that can bring me business development leads from the biggest companies in the world. He was not even saying that he wanted to work with private VCs. He had worked with them in the earlier stage of the company, had taken their money, worked with them to get better, to build value creation. And then he realized that he was at a point where now we throttle up on sales, and it's actually the corporates, he's actually in the industry 4.0 space, I mentioned him earlier today. He was actually, selling to big giant companies with manufacturing lines. So he wanted investors who could bring that to the table. He was even disciplined enough to say, I'm already working with certain companies, so the corporate venture capitalist teams from those companies are not on my list. It takes tremendous conviction and an understanding of where you want to go to be able to do that, but I was very impressed. Finally, of course, as Kousha mentioned earlier today, we're talking about, sorry, just one more comment on the last slide. This is an XTC pitch that we're focused on. So, I want to challenge the team to think carefully about the statements that you will make in your ask that speak to XTC. I can't do that for you because, number one, you all know your business is obviously better than me and the challenges that you're facing and that you will overcome in servicing the world. But also, if I make any further comments on this, I don't want to risk everybody's pitch kind of sounding the same in the very last slide. So I'll mainly leave that up to you. I know you're all going to do really well in talking about how you address those global challenges. Finally, and I know we're getting perhaps a little short on time, so I might have to throttle up here, is let's cover really quickly some other pitfalls that are based on observations I've seen over the years. Number one, and earlier you heard a lot about this in terms of how do you present in a virtual environment like here on Zoom today. Presence cannot be understated. Again, somebody on the previous session also mentioned, body language, for example. These things are super important. I've learned to read people in a room, and now increasingly on Zoom. It's not as easy, but it can be done. I've learned to read their presence, which is basically, how do they present themselves? How do they sit? what's their poise? What's their tone of their voice? Even what is their word choices? I can tell people aren't comfortable with their own content if they're, all the time. That's sort of the basic stuff. But this stuff is so super important. Again, you heard about a lot of this earlier today. We don't have time to go into a lot of the details, but I would carefully consider, and of course, practice with each other on your own teams, and then practice with other people to get a sense of how you're doing. And like you heard earlier today from Kousha, recording yourself is fantastic. It's very painful to watch yourself. I find this very painful to watch myself. I'm sure I'll force myself to watch even today's video later. We all realize this is painful, but it must be done. I've already kind of mentioned the second one, which is practice and test. The key point here is you can test not only your presence, but your business models, your strategies. What are other smart people around the table actually saying on all these topics? Investors really want to know this. They typically don't want to hear from just one person, say the founder of the company. They want to hear that that founder has actually talked to a multitude of voices. Believe it or not, even Steve Jobs, who many people think ran Apple, with no other decision makers, behind the scenes was actually working very closely over the years, and he got better at this. You can read numerous biographies on this. He actually got better on this over time, and he brought a lot of smart voices to the table behind the scenes and took in a lot of that input. Another key point I'd want to make is skate to where the puck is going. So that's a quote from the hockey star Wayne Gretzky from Canada. He was once asked, how are you such an awesome hockey player?
JC, if I could step in at this point, we have about 10 minutes left.
Q&A?
So it'll be great to go to Q&A, and some of them will line up to the pitfalls that you're talking about.
Perfect.
So
let's just do that then.
All right, fantastic. So folks, as before, if you have any questions, please use the raise hand feature. Open your camera and mics, and then introduce yourself to ask the question. While we wait, JC, on your slide on the ask, there was a question. Do we need to specify the round name or just the amount? That was from Damian Kudela of Cayuga Biotech.
Yeah, I would definitely name the round. Over the years, larger seeds are what used to be Series A. So, you don't want to get into a situation where you're sort of confusing the investors. Because remember, think about the inflection points that I talked about. What the investor is doing is they're making sort of a mental calculation of the age of your company, the amount you've already raised, and then the amount you will need to raise in the future. So if they don't know where you are on that timeline, Series A, Series B, whatever, it sort of makes it a little bit difficult, and it's sort of awkward if they have to ask. So I would definitely talk about both topics. And then, experienced VCs will also immediately sort of get a sense of, what are actually the names of the rounds in the current times, because, like I sort of mentioned, you're seeing really huge seed rounds, which many years ago might have been actually an A round. So best to not cause confusion on where you are in the life cycle of your company and what the actual round is today, be it, seed, Series A, or what have you.
Thank you.
This is Damien. So follow up, if we're talking with corporate venture, is there a minimum amount? Because we're predicting about $10 million to get to our inflection point, which I guess that's a Series A now in biotech. Should we, do we bump it up for corporate venture, make it more attractive, like 15, 20 million?
No, I think, look, what you need to raise should be informed by your financial modeling, right? Remember how I talked about, what you need to get to break even, what are the inflection points? It sounds like you have an understanding of some of your inflection points. So what is that dollar value? And then cross-reference that with what is the CVC comfortable with? They're not all created equal. Their check sizes are, anywhere from actually quite small to actually very large. And sometimes they have great flexibility to move anywhere in that range. And sometimes they have a very specific, call it, sub 5 million, or they like to do I had one CVC tell me one time, yeah, we like to do only around 10. So they definitely don't do 1 or 2, and they don't go over 10 in any circumstance. And then, of course, you have to think about, the total value that you want to raise versus, the syndicate. So are you talking about a couple of corporate VCs at 5 million each, or, some sort of different combination? It's not, you shouldn't be embarrassed, or it's not awkward to ask this up front. Hopefully the CVCs have actually made this clear before you even get to it. Kind of like, when you intro the team, I typically talk about Samsung Catalyst Fund. We're a $500 million evergreen fund. We typically write checks, multi-stage, and we typically write checks up to 5 million. So, I already get that on the table as to not make it awkward later, and you just go from there.
Thank you, JC. Any other questions? Maybe while we wait, JC, we can bring back the pitfalls slide.
Yeah, that's right. So I was talking about Wayne. I was talking about Wayne Gretzky, the hockey great, and he said, I don't skate to where the puck is, I skate to where the puck is going. So he's actually predicting the future in real time, and and he's at the puck before everybody else is even thinking about it. So why do I bring this up? What I find is I've come across many teams that aren't quite prepared to go into the Q&A session during a pitch with VCs. And what I would propose is that you actually predict what those questions might be. So one way you can do this is test each other, pretend that you're not actually a part of your company. What would you want to know about the company? And what sort of questions would you ask? And then test this with your advisory board, other experts in your industry. Maybe you've got some friends that may not be a VC fit for you, but you can do this exercise. And, I've worked with CEOs that it's amazing. It's almost like they scripted out every single combination in the world when it comes to Q&A. And no matter what they were asked, they just immediately jumped right into an answer. And I could tell, they've studied this, they've thought about it, and they practiced before they even showed up to this room. That's the position you want to be into when it comes to skating to where the puck is going. Related to this is, if you don't have an answer, the worst case scenario, and believe it or not, I've seen this far too many times, sometimes founders on the fly, because perhaps they are panicking or they just feel so awkward, they actually make stuff up. And this does not build credibility. It doesn't show preparation, it doesn't show maturity and being thoughtful. The best way to approach this is to literally say, I don't know that. I'll find out. That's kind of like level 1. But if you really want to level up, propose a solution. I don't know that, but I'm going to find out, because I'm going to go to my advisory board expert who's worked in this space for X amount of years, or I'm going to go to a personal friend of mine who's an expert in this space. I will get a solution and I will get back to you next week. that shows much more thoughtfulness and confidence that you're a problem solver, and that's what investors want to hear. Another thing, that I'll bring up for teams that are highly technical and those that are building highly technical, innovative products, it's really a good idea to distill very complicated technologies down to the basics. On our team, we just call them the basic building blocks, and we love to see teams literally just draw them out. Despite the fact we have a very technical team ourselves, the point to start this discussion is just the basic diagram of the different components of innovation in your highly complex technology, and to sort of begin the discussion with just that. It sounds very easy to do, but I've seen over the years that it's actually quite difficult for people that have very, very deep technical training. But the good news is that it actually can be done. Those very technical people have to realize that not everybody's as smart as they are, and they may need to do a little more basic explanation to other people.
JC, we got a question
Yes.
from Joy Pardrach, and the question is, can you tell us more about how the judges will be viewing our pitch? Is it on their own computer so that they can control toggling between seeing our slides and us as the presenter, or will that be controlled for them so they can see both? And I think it may be okay if Barrett also steps in to answer this question, because it's about mechanics of the XTC.
Yep, sure. Happy to jump in here. Thanks, Joy. They will be watching the pitches much like you're watching the pitches today. And so they'll be able to see your screen, your pitch, your slides, however they arrange their screen. So they'll be able to see it all at the same time, just like you are today. So it won't be done for them, and they won't be in any central location. It'll just be like today.
Thank you, Barrett. So, JC, I had a question while I was listening to your pitch, and you and Kousha described how important it is to up-level the pitches and actually make it count so that people know that you're prepared and the audience knows you're prepared. But tell me, in your mind, when you see a pitch, what do the first 2 minutes look like? What really captivates your attention for a company?
I would say two things. Number one, team is super important. Is the team outfitted to address whatever the challenge is, whatever the market is? What is their background? What is their experience? Education is important as well, but it's not the primary thing. It's really about a combination of, and you have to keep in mind that we do very core tech investing a lot of the time. What are their technical chops, as they say? And just sort of their work experiences. What do they bring to the table? The second part is the nature of the innovation. Are they doing something that just is incrementally better, or are they literally looking at a problem from an orthogonal, completely different angle that nobody has kind of considered before? Or in some way, is there when we're looking at a highly technical product, is it not incrementally better, but is it massively better? I often hear things like, oh, we're 5% or 10% cheaper, or our performance is 10% better. Frankly, that doesn't wow me. If those numbers, if they triple, quadruple, or sometimes we've seen even greater than 100% on the improvement side, then I think, things become very interesting. So whatever your product is, wherever your team comes from, kind of wowing the audience in the first 2 minutes on who you are and why your product is awesome across whatever dimensions are important, that is super important. Sometimes you may have a business model advantage, which is sort of a slightly different discussion, but you have to kind of capture the audience with the magic around why your business model is innovative. That's what I would say needs to be done in the first 2 minutes.
Thank you, JC. So with that, we are coming to the end of this session. So JC, Kousha, if anybody in the audience wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, probably multiple ways. Yeah, I'll just throw one out. So people could shoot me an email at letter J, letter N, .Charles, my family name, at Samsung.com.
All right.
And for me, you can reach out over email. My first name the first 3 letters of my last name. That's NAV @Samsung.com.
Excellent. Well, thank you both for taking the time and going in depth on what it takes to do pitch training. So with that, we'll move on to the next session.